A girl was sold at $70 for being wild. Lonely rancher bought her for $100 when he saw her tattoo. The town was a godless pit exuding desperation, greed, and casual cruelty. Kalen watched the auction from the shadows, a ghost in his own life. He had come for horses, not for trouble. The tin horn auctioneer's voice was a foul noise selling off a girl with wild, haunted eyes. Kalen's face was a mask of detachment. He was done with the world's misery. He turned to leave, but then a flash of ink on her wrist, an eagle sheltering a blooming cactus. The scar on his side ached with a memory he'd tried to bury for a decade. The desert. The blood. The woman who had saved him and vanished, leaving only that image behind. A life debt. Unpaid. $7, the auctioneer crowed. Before the hammer fell, Kalen's voice cut through the heat. "Stop. I'll buy her." Now she stood before him, the living ghost of his salvation. He had just paid a fortune for a memory, but bought himself a whole heap of trouble. He'd saved her from the auction, but who would save him from what was coming for them both? The sun was a hammer over Dusty Creek, beating the world into a shimmering haze of rust-colored dust and silent desperation. It was a godless place, a final stop for men whose luck had run dry, leaving behind only the grit in their teeth and the bitter taste of cheap whiskey. From the shadows of the saloon's porch, Kalen watched it all, his face a mask of stone, his eyes holding the flat, placid surface of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He had come for thoroughbreds, a simple transaction of coin for horseflesh. He had not come for this. He had not come for the spectacle unfolding in the center of the street. A crude wooden platform served as the stage. Upon it, a man whose sweat stained the collar of his shirt like a map of his own greed postured and bellowed. He was a tin horn auctioneer selling off the dregs of humanity, and his prize offering today was a girl. She stood silent, a pillar of stillness amidst the auctioneer's frantic noise. Her hair was a tangled nest of black, her simple dress torn and stained with the land itself. She was a wraith, a whisper of a person. The crowd jeered their taunts like stones thrown at a stray dog. They called her cursed, a half-breed witch, a mute. Her silence, Kalen noted, was her only armor. It was a profound and unnerving thing. He saw the flicker of fire deep in her eyes, a defiant ember refusing to be extinguished by the wind of their hatred. Another lost soul in a land full of them. The thought was cold, distant. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for anyone else's. He pushed himself from the wall, the worn leather of his gun belt creaking softly. Time to go. The horses wouldn't buy themselves, and the air here was thick with a cruelty that settled in the back of his throat. "Look at her, gentlemen. Won't cause you no trouble because she don't speak a word," the auctioneer shouted, grabbing her arm to spin her around. "Strong back for field work or other chores." A wave of leering laughter rippled through the miners. The motion, rough and sudden, tore the frayed sleeve of her dress. It slipped down her shoulder, exposing the pale skin of her upper arm, and, for a fleeting second, her wrist. Kalen froze. His hand went instinctively to the puckered scar on his side, hidden beneath his fine cotton shirt. The world of Dusty Creek dissolved. The heat, the noise, the stench of unwashed bodies, it all vanished, replaced by a memory forged in agony. The searing pain, a fire ripping through his flesh. The taste of blood and sand. He remembered the sky, a merciless empty blue, and the certainty of his own death as he lay bleeding out in the vast, silent emptiness of the high desert. A shadow fell over him then. Not a vulture, but a woman. Her face was a blur, her features lost to his fevered mind, but he remembered her hands. Hands that moved with a desperate, knowing grace, crushing wild herbs, their clean, sharp scent cutting through the coppery tang of his own blood. She had pressed the poultice to his wound, a cool shock against the fire. And as his world faded to black, his last conscious sight was of her wrist held steady in the blinding sun. And the ink upon it. An eagle. its wings a fortress around a single blooming cactus flower, a life debt, unpaid, a ghost he thought long buried, $7. The auctioneer's voice blared, snapping Kalen back to the suffocating present. Going for a pittance, boys, who'll give me $7 for this silent little piece. The man who had bid, a greasy buffalo hunter with yellow teeth, grinned, tossing a coin in the air. The hammer was raised. This was not mercy. Kalen knew nothing of mercy. This was not righteousness. He had forsaken that path long ago. It was something else entirely. A reckoning. A debt that screamed from the past, demanding payment in the here and now. He stepped out of the shadows. Stop. The word was not loud, but it sliced through the midday stupor like a shard of ice. Every head turned. The auctioneer paused, his arm locked in the air. Kalen walked forward, his boots stirring small puffs of dust, his long coat settling around him as he came to a halt before the platform. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked at the girl. At Serafina. Her eyes for the first time widened with something other than defiance. It was confusion. The auctioneer found his voice a sycophantic grin spreading across his face. Well now, Mr. Kalen, a man of taste. Looking for some new help at the ranch, are we? The current bid is $7. I'll buy her. Kalen said, his voice flat and cold, leaving no room for negotiation. Excellent. Shall we say 10? Sir Kalen's gaze finally shifted to the auctioneer, and the man flinched as if struck. $100, Kalen stated. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $100 in gold coin was a small fortune. It was a preposterous, insane sum for a girl they deemed worthless. It was the price of a prize bull, not a stray. 100? The auctioneer stammered, his eyes bulging. Kalen simply stared, his silence a more potent threat than any shouted word. Sold, the man screeched, bringing his hammer down with a loud crack, as if afraid Kalen might change his mind. Sold to Mr. Kalen for $100, he tossed a heavy pouch of coins onto the platform. It landed with a dull, final thud. He watched as the girl's ropes were cut. She stumbled forward, pushed from the platform landing in the dust before him. She looked up, her breathing shallow, her body trembling slightly. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only the wild, wary look of a trapped animal facing a new, unpredictable predator. He had saved her from the hyenas, but she did not know if he was not simply a wolf in finer clothing. And as he stood there, the living ghost of his salvation before him, Kalen had to admit he wasn't entirely sure himself. He had just paid the price for a memory, but what in God's name had he truly bought? Silence followed the crack of the auctioneer's hammer. It was a heavy, watchful thing, thicker than the dust that danced in the afternoon sun. The whispers of the crowd died, replaced by the unified weight of 100 staring eyes. Kalen felt them on his back, 1,000 tiny pinpricks of judgment, envy, and suspicion. He had just thrown a wrench into the crude, simple machinery of their town, and they did not know what to make of it. He ignored them. His world had narrowed to the space between himself and the girl. Serafina. She stood unmoving in the dust where she had been pushed, her thin shoulders squared. Her gaze was locked on his, a shield of wild, untamed energy. He saw no gratitude there. He saw no fear. He saw a question sharp and piercing. With a curt nod of his head, he turned, walking toward the livery where his horse and wagon were tied. He did not look back to see if she was following. He simply walked the rhythm of his own boots on the hard-packed earth, the only sound in his mind. He half expected her to bolt, to vanish back into the alleys and shadows from whence she came. A part of him, the sensible part that dealt in profit and loss, almost hoped she would. It would be simpler. But then he heard it. The soft, hesitant scuff of worn-out shoes behind him, a reluctant echo to his own determined stride. She was following. The walk was the longest 100 yards of Kalen's life. Every window held a face. Every doorway held a shadow. They were a spectacle, the wealthy solitary rancher and the cursed silent girl he had bought for the price of a small herd. He could already hear the stories that would be spun, tales of madness or dark intentions. Let them talk. Their opinions were worth less than the dust on his boots. He reached his wagon, a sturdy buckboard laden with supplies for the long ride home. He untied his horse, a powerful gray gelding that shifted impatiently, sensing its master's turmoil. Only then did he turn to face her fully. She had stopped a few feet away, a wary distance between them. The fire in her eyes had not dimmed. "There's water?" he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. He gestured with his chin toward a canteen hanging from the side of the wagon. She watched him, her head tilted slightly like a hawk assessing its prey. She did not move. Her stillness was an accusation, a challenge. Was this a trick, a test? A sigh escaped Kalen's lips, a sound of profound weariness. He was not built for this. He was a man of fences and ledgers of solitude bought and paid for. He unhooked the canteen himself, uncorked it, and held it out to her. His movements were slow, deliberate, the way one might approach a spooked mare. Her eyes flickered from the canteen to his face and back again. For a long moment she did nothing. Then, with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with her ragged appearance, she stepped forward and took it. Her fingers brushed his, a touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt through him. She drank not greedily, but with a deep, desperate thirst, her throat working. When she was done, she handed it back, her gaze never leaving his. "Get in," he said, gesturing to the back of the buckboard. She obeyed, climbing into the wagon and settling herself amongst the canvas sacks, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. A small, self-contained island of misery. But her eyes never stopped watching. Kalen mounted his horse, tied its lead to the wagon, and with a sharp click of his tongue set them in motion. They rolled out of Dusty Creek, leaving the whispers and the stares behind them, and entered the vast, aching emptiness of the plains. The world opened up a canvas of endless sky and distant heat-shimmered mesas. The suffocating judgment of the town was replaced by the profound indifference of the land. Here a man was measured not by his coin or his reputation, but by his ability to endure. Here Kalen could breathe. He rode on the wagon, creaking behind him, the silence stretching for miles. His mind, however, was a maelstrom. The tattoo, an eagle and a cactus flower. He had seen it only once, seared into his memory by fever and pain. Now the ghost of that memory had a face, a name he did not know, a silence he could not fathom. Was she the daughter of the woman who had saved him, a sister? Or was the symbol a tribal marking shared by many? The questions gnawed at him, unwelcome and persistent. He glanced back. Serafina was not looking at him. She was looking out at the landscape, her expression intense, her eyes scanning the rock formations and the sparse vegetation. She looked at home. More at home than she had ever looked in that town. It was another hour before trouble found them. Well, look what we have here." The voice, thick with whiskey and malice, came from behind a crop of rocks. Two riders emerged, blocking the trail. Kalen recognized one of them instantly. It was the greasy buffalo hunter from the auction, his face flushed with drink and emboldened by greed. His companion was a wiry man with cold, dead eyes. "That's far enough, mister." The hunter sneered, his hand resting on the butt of a tarnished pistol. "Me and my friend here, we feel a bit cheated. Seems a fine gentleman like you overpaid for that piece of property. We're prepared to take her off your hands. For a discount, of course, say $20. Kalen reined in his horse, his body going. Still his face unreadable. He could feel Serafina's sudden tension from the wagon behind him. "The transaction is over." Kalen said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Ride on." The hunter laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I don't think so. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the fun way. Your choice." He began to draw his pistol. It was the last choice he ever made. Kalen's hand moved in a blur. It was not the movement of a rancher, but of a man for whom violence was an old, familiar language. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. There was a single, deafening crack. The hunter's eyes went wide, a look of comical surprise on his face as a dark hole appeared in the hand holding his gun. He screamed, dropping the pistol as blood sprayed. The wiry companion, frozen in shock, only had time to open his mouth before Kalen's voice, now cold as a grave, stopped him. "Leave the gun," Kalen commanded. "Take your friend. And if I ever see either of you again, my aim will be 2 feet higher. Now get." They scrambled the wounded man whimpering and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the dropped pistol behind. The silence that returned was absolute, broken only by the wind. Slowly, Kalen holstered his Colt, the scent of gunpowder sharp in the air. The ghost of the man he used to be settled back into its cage. He took a deep breath and turned in his saddle to look at Serafina. She was staring not at the fleeing riders, but at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a new light. Not fear. It was recognition. He saw a small scratch on the back of his hand, a thin line of red where a stray piece of gravel must have kicked up. Before he could react, she moved. She leaned out of the wagon, her fingers plucking a single broad leaf from a dusty green plant growing by the trail. She brought it to her lips, chewed it for a second into a dark mash, and then leaning forward, she gently, firmly pressed the poultice onto his hand. The motion was exact. The scent of the crushed leaf was identical. It was the same herb, the same touch, the same impossible magic. Kalen stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was no daughter. This was no sister. The woman who had saved his life a decade ago had been older, her face lined with experience. But the hands, the knowledge, the ghost, it was her. It had always been her. And she hadn't aged a day. The world tilted on its axis. The wind, which had been a simple, mindless thing, suddenly felt alive, whispering a language Kalen could not comprehend. He stared at his hand, at the dark green mash of herbs pressed against his skin. The scent, sharp and clean, was a key unlocking a chamber in his memory he had sealed shut with stone and mortar. It was the scent of his own survival. He looked up at Serafina. The girl, the child woman with the haunted eyes and the ragged dress, seemed to shift before him. The sun caught in her dark hair, creating a halo of impossible light. He was no longer seeing the urchin from the auction block. He was seeing a ghost. A decade-old specter of salvation made flesh. But it made no sense. The woman who saved him had been a woman grown, her face etched with the wisdom of years. This was a girl. And she had not aged a day. Impossible. The word was a silent scream in his mind. His logical world, a world of fences, ledgers, and the predictable cycles of seasons, was fracturing. How, the word tore from his throat, raw and broken. Serafina pulled her hand back, her eyes for the first time showing a flicker of something he could almost name. Not fear, vulnerability. She looked from his face to the plains around them as if the land itself held the only answer she was allowed to give. He grabbed the reins of his horse, his knuckles white. He needed to move to outrun the vertigo that threatened to unseat him. "We're going," he said, his voice tight. The rest of the journey was a long, thrumming silence. Kalen rode hard, pushing the horses, pushing himself, desperate to reach the familiar sanctuary of his ranch. He needed walls around him. He needed order. He needed to force this impossible breathing mystery into a world he could control. He did not look back at her again, but he felt her presence. It was no longer the weight of a burden or a debt. It was the unnerving hum of a power he could not name. They arrived as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery gold. Kalen's ranch was a sprawling territory carved out of the wilderness, a testament to a decade of relentless work. The house was large and imposing, built of dark timber and river stone, its windows like vacant eyes looking out over the valley. It was a fortress of solitude, a lonely kingdom for a lonely king. An old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes as sharp as a hawk's stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Martha. She'd been his father's housekeeper, and now she was the only other soul who shared this vast empty space. Her sharp eyes took in the scene at once: Kalen, grim-faced and splattered with dust, the wagon, and the small silent figure huddled in the back. "Lord have mercy, Kalen," she said, her voice dry as kindling. "I thought you went to town for horses, not strays." Kalen dismounted his body, aching with a weariness that went deeper than the trail. "She's not a stray, Martha. Her name is Seraphina. Get a room ready, and a bath, and some of your old clothes that might fit her." Martha's eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping over Seraphina's ragged form with open suspicion. "The girl from the auction. The whole valley's already buzzin' with the news. They say you paid a king's ransom. They say she's a mute curse." "I don't care what they say." Kalen snapped, his patience worn thin. "Do as I ask." Martha, unaccustomed to his sharp tone, pressed her lips into a thin line, but nodded. "As you wish. But don't you blame me if we wake up and find all the milk soured." He watched as Martha led Seraphina into the house. The girl went without a word, but she cast one last long look at Kalen over her shoulder. It was a look that held a universe of unspoken things. He was her savior, her captor, and a man as lost as she was. Later that night, the house was silent. Kalen sat in his study, a cavern of leather-bound books and dark wood, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He tried to focus on his ledgers, on the neat columns of figures that had always brought him a sense of control. But the numbers swam before his eyes. All he could see was a tattoo. All he could smell was a strange, healing herb. He walked out of the study and down the long, dark hall. He stopped outside the guest room door. He stood there for a long time, listening. There was no sound, no weeping, no movement. Just a silence that felt ancient and deep. What was she thinking behind that door? What was she? A witch? A spirit? A girl burdened with an impossible gift? He returned to his study, the questions a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He picked up his glass and finally drank the whiskey, a welcome fire in his throat. He glanced at his hand, at the small scratch the buffalo hunter's stray gravel had given him. He expected to see the green poultice, but it was gone. He held his hand closer to the lamplight, his heart stopping. There was no scratch. There was no mark. The skin was smooth, unbroken, as if the injury had never happened. The healing had not been a matter of days or hours. It had been a matter of moments. A cold dread mingled with a terrifying awe washed over him. A noise from outside drew him to the window. He looked out into the vast, moon-drenched night. The corrals were silvered geometries in the darkness. His horses, his prized, powerful thoroughbreds, were not in their stalls. They were gathered in the center of the main corral. And she was with them. Seraphina, now clean, her dark hair flowing over the shoulders of a simple borrowed dress, stood among the herd. The horses were calm, their powerful bodies relaxed. They surrounded her not with fear, but with a quiet reverence. Kalen watched his breath caught in his throat as his most aggressive stallion, a beast of pure fire and muscle that not even his most experienced ranch hands could tame, lowered its massive head. It nudged her hand gently like a docile colt, and Seraphina raised her hand, resting it on the stallion's powerful neck, her touch a silent blessing. Kalen stepped back from the window, a tremor running through him. He had not brought a girl to his ranch. He hadn't even brought a ghost. He had brought home a power as wild and untamable as the land itself. and it was now living under his roof, sleeping in his guest room, and speaking a silent language to the beasts in his fields. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the world would not let such a power live in peace for long. Sleep did not come for Kalin that night. The moon traced its silver path across his floorboards while he stood sentinel at his window. The image of the girl and the stallion burned into his mind. He had spent a decade building this ranch into a fortress, its fences and routines a bulwark against the chaos of the world and the ghosts within himself. In a single night, this silent girl had breached every defense. She hadn't stormed his gates with force, but had simply walked through them, bringing with her a power as old and inexplicable as the mountains that loomed over his valley. The morning arrived crisp and clean, smelling of coffee and pine smoke. It was a morning like any other. Ranch hands shouted greetings in the yard. The blacksmith's hammer rang with a familiar, steady rhythm. The world was pretending to be sane. Kalin walked into the kitchen, his heart a cold knot in his chest. Martha was at the stove, her back rigid with disapproval, and Serafina was there sitting at the long wooden table. She was clean, her dark hair combed and braided, wearing a simple calico dress that was too large for her thin frame. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, but her eyes, when they lifted to meet his, were ageless. He sat down opposite her. Martha placed a plate of eggs and bacon before him with a thud. The silence was thick with unspoken words. He had to know. The stallion Kalin said, his voice quiet, almost cautious. Midnight. He's never let another soul lay a hand on him. He's nearly killed 3 of my best men. Serafina looked at him, her dark eyes holding his gaze. The kitchen was so quiet he could hear the frantic beat of his own heart. She opened her lips, and for the first time a voice emerged. It was soft, low, like the sound of water running over smooth stones. He was not angry, she whispered. Just lonely. The 3 words struck Kalin with the force of a physical blow. It was a diagnosis, a perfect, impossible summary of the wild, violent beast in the corral and of the man sitting at the table. He felt stripped bare, seen in a way that was both terrifying and deeply unsettling. Martha gasped from the stove. She speaks. Serafina's gaze dropped to her hands as if the effort of those few words had exhausted her. The moment of connection was gone, leaving Kalin adrift in a sea of new questions. The day passed in a dreamlike haze. Serafina moved through the ranch with a quiet purpose. She was not a prisoner. She was not a guest. She simply was. Kalin watched her from a distance. He saw her in Martha's herb garden, her fingers brushing against the leaves of sage and chamomile with an innate familiarity. He saw her mend a torn saddle blanket with small perfect stitches, her movements economical and sure. A fragile peace began to settle over him, a sense of rightness that his vast empty house had never known. It was a dangerous feeling. Peace was a luxury he could not afford. The danger arrived late in the afternoon in the form of a rider galloping hard from the north pasture. It was a young ranch hand named Billy, his face pale with alarm. Mr. Kalin, he panted, reining his horse to a skidding halt. There's someone up there, on the ridge overlooking the springs. A surveyor, he says. But his tracks, they ain't right. Kalin's blood ran cold. What about them? He's riding a shod horse, but he's walking it in circles, looking at the ground like he's tracing a map. And he left this. Billy held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a single jet-black stone, sharpened to a cruel point like a primitive arrowhead. It was not a local rock. It was obsidian, volcanic glass, a calling card. Kalin took the stone. It was cold, unnaturally so. He knew that stone. It was the signature of a man who dealt in slow, methodical ruin, a man who enjoyed watching things fall apart. Malachi Strand. He's here, Kalin whispered to himself. He wasn't just a ghost from the past anymore. He was a presence, a predator testing the fences of Kalen's territory. He looked up from the stone, his gaze sweeping across the sprawling land he had bled for the empire of solitude he had built to keep the world at bay. His eyes landed on the kitchen window. Through the glass he could see Seraphina humming a soft, wordless tune as she ground herbs in a bowl. He had brought her here to save her, to pay a debt, but he saw the truth of it now with a terrible, soul-crushing clarity. He hadn't brought her into his fortress for protection. He had brought her into the heart of the battlefield, and the war was just beginning. The obsidian arrowhead was a splinter of night in Kalen's palm. It felt unnaturally cold, a cold that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the cold of a calculated malice, a patient and deeply personal threat. This was not a random act of intimidation. This was a message written in the language of predator and prey. I am here. I see you. And what you think is yours has always been mine. The fragile piece of the last day shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghost of the man Kalen had been the soldier. The commander awoke from its long slumber. He strode to the porch, the arrowhead clutched tight in his fist. Billy! He roared, his voice carrying across the yard with an authority that made men snap to attention. Saddle up. I want patrols riding the full perimeter dusk till dawn. Arm every man on this ranch. No one sets foot in this valley. Not a trapper, not a priest, not a lost child without me knowing about it. Move the ranch, once a quiet haven of work and routine, transformed into an armed camp. There was a new tension in the air, a sharp metallic taste of anticipation. Beneath Kalen's cold commands, a white-hot fury was building. It was a fury he had not felt in years. It was not for his land, not for his pride. It was for the quiet girl in his kitchen humming a tune from a world he didn't know. He had built this place to keep evil out. Now he would turn it into a fortress to keep her safe within it. He found her in the study. She stood before the massive, unlit fireplace, her small frame dwarfed by the towering stone mantelpiece. She looked up as he entered, her humming ceasing. He walked to his desk, the heavy oak, a bastion of logic in a world that no longer made sense. He placed the obsidian arrowhead on the polished wood. It lay there between them, a stark and ugly thing. I know you can speak. He began, his voice low and intense. Now I need you to talk to me. Do you know this? He pointed a single steady finger at the stone. Seraphina's eyes fell upon the arrowhead. A change came over her so profound it was as if a winter storm had descended into the room. The quiet composure vanished, replaced by a deep, visceral terror that made her take a half-step back. A small wounded sound escaped her lips. His mark, she whispered, her voice trembling. Whose mark? Kalen pressed his own heart, hammering. The shadow that devours the sun. She said her words strange and poetic. Her eyes were wide, seeing not the study but a past filled with fire and death. The man you call Malachi Strand. The name spoken aloud hung in the air like a death sentence. He destroyed your people, Kalen stated. It was not a question. She nodded a single, sharp movement. Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. He did not come for our land. He came for what is in the land, for the secret of the water. Kalen felt a jolt of understanding. The springs. The surveyor on the ridge overlooking the springs. The water, he prompted gently. What about the water? She looked at him then, and her gaze held the weight of a dying generation. My people were not of this land. We came from the south long ago, following the stars to a hidden valley. The springs there, they are not like other water. They run deep from the heart of the earth. They slow the passing of years. They mend flesh that is torn. They are the source of our healing, the source of our long lives. It all clicked into place. Her impossible, ageless appearance, the miraculous healing of his hand. It was not magic. It was something far more real and far more valuable. And Strand knows Kalen breathed the full monstrous scope of the man's ambition revealing itself. He didn't want silver or gold. He wanted to own life itself. He wanted to sell eternity from a bottle. He tortured the secret from one of our elders before he died. Seraphina continued, her voice gaining a steely edge of grief and rage. He murdered us. All of us. To keep the secret for himself. He thought I had perished with the others. He thought the knowledge was lost. Her hand instinctively went to her wrist, covering the tattoo. But the knowledge is not lost. It is remembered. Kalen looked from her face to the sprawling map of his property pinned to the wall. He saw the deeds and titles he had fought so hard for, the black ink defining the borders of his lonely kingdom. He had bought the land for its solitude. He now knew with a certainty that shook him to his very soul that he had bought it for its sacred heart. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a guardian. He walked to the map, his finger tracing the blue line of the creek that fed his entire valley. He pointed to its source high in the northern pastures. The springs. This is where he was, Kalen said, his voice a low growl. This is what he wants, and this is where he will strike. The room was filled with the flickering of the lamp, casting their two shadows long and intertwined across the map of the valley. Kalen felt Seraphina move to stand beside him. She was no longer trembling. The fear in her eyes had been forged into a cold, hard resolve. She placed her small hand on the map next to his. "It is where we will be waiting," she said. Her voice was not a whisper anymore. It was the clear, steady voice of a queen preparing to defend her last remaining territory. And as Kalen looked at her, at the fierce, unbroken spirit in her eyes, he knew he was no longer a man paying a debt to a ghost. He was a soldier standing shoulder to shoulder with his commanding officer, and their war had just been declared. The night before, the battle was unnaturally still. A sliver of moon hung in the star-dusted sky, casting the valley in shades of silver and deep, menacing shadow. Every man on the ranch was in position, a rifle in his hand, his heart a steady drumbeat in the profound quiet. Kalen stood on the ridge overlooking the sacred springs, the cold night air a balm on his feverish mind. He was a tactician once more, the land his map, the stars his silent witnesses. But the familiar coldness of command was gone, replaced by a fierce protective warmth that centered on the woman standing beside him. She was not looking at the paths where the enemy would approach. She was looking at the water which shimmered in the moonlight, seeming to breathe with a life of its own. "My grandmother used to say this water holds the memory of every sunrise," Seraphina whispered, her voice no longer timid but filled with a quiet strength. "It remembers the good. It will not be claimed by evil." Kalen didn't believe in omens, but as he looked at her, at the unwavering faith in her eyes, he felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He was no longer fighting the ghosts of his past. He was fighting for the future of a ghost who had taught him how to live again. They came with the dawn. Malachi Strand and his men rode into the valley not like a band of outlaws, but like a disciplined cavalry unit. They were professionals, their faces hard, their movements efficient. Strand himself rode at their head, an impeccable figure in a dark coat, his posture regal. He looked, Kalen thought, like a banker come to foreclose on the world. He stopped his men at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes taking in the scene. He saw Kalen and Seraphina waiting for him by the springs. A slow, arrogant smile touched his lips. A welcoming party. Strand called out, his voice smooth and cultured, a jarring sound in the wild landscape. "How thoughtful. You've been a stubborn apparition, Kalen. I should have ensured you were properly buried a decade ago." His gaze shifted to Seraphina. "And you, my dear girl. The last little weed from a garden I took such pains to clear. The water and the life it offers belongs to men of vision, men who build empires, not to savages and forgotten spirits. This land already has guardians, Kalen's voice rang out clear and steady. And you are not welcome here. Strand laughed a dry, humorless sound. Guardians, I see only a broken-down soldier and a half-breed girl. This ends now. He raised his hand, a signal to attack. But Kalen was ready. He returned the signal, and the valley itself erupted. It was not the simple chaos of a gunfight. On Kalen's command, his ranch hands hidden in the high rocks sent a dozen strategically placed boulders crashing down the slopes, cutting off Strand's men, separating them, sowing panic. It was a classic ambush taught by a master. Strand, caught by surprise, roared in fury as his disciplined attack dissolved into a confused melee. He spurred his horse forward, his eyes burning with the singular purpose: kill the girl, secure the springs. He charged toward Seraphina, but Kalen met him halfway. The two men collided, their fight a brutal personal vortex in the midst of the larger battle. It was a clash of two worlds. Strand fought with the cold, vicious precision of a man who believes he is entitled to everything. Kalen fought with the desperate, righteous fury of a man who has finally found something worth dying for. As they grappled, Seraphina acted. She let out a sharp, piercing whistle, not a sound of fear, but a command. From a hidden corral, a gate swung open, and a wave of pure, thundering life was unleashed. The stallion Midnight, followed by the entire herd of Kalen's horses, galloped into the fray, their hooves churning the earth, their powerful bodies a chaotic, unstoppable force that scattered Strand's remaining men like dry leaves. The final confrontation was just two men standing by the water's edge. Strand, disarmed and bleeding from a cut on his brow, sneered at Kalen. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're protecting. I would have sold this water to kings. I would have built a new world. You build nothing." Kalen said, his voice low, his breathing ragged. "You only take." He saw not just Strand, but the face of every predator, every man who built his fortune on the ruins of other people's lives. He raised his pistol, and this time it was an act of justice. The shot echoed once across the valley, a single final punctuation mark. And then there was peace. The sun rose fully, bathing the valley in a clean golden light. The battle was over. The surviving mercenaries had fled. Kalen stood by the springs, wounded and exhausted, but alive. Seraphina approached him, her face calm, the morning light catching in her dark hair. The water flowed beside them, clear and pure, as if washing the world clean. Kalen looked at her, the depth of his feelings a vast, uncharted territory. He had found his redemption in protecting her. Now he had to set her free. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "The land is safe. The secret is safe. It's yours, Seraphina. You are free to go wherever you wish." He offered her the world. He expected her to take it. She looked away from the springs, away from the land that held the memory of her people, and looked at him. Her eyes held not the past, but the promise of a future. A small, true smile touched her lips for the first time. "My home is not a memory in the ground," she said, her voice soft but sure. "My home is with the man who saw a ghost and gave it a place to live." She took his wounded hand in hers, and in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the land they had fought for, they were no longer a debtor and a specter, a rancher and a stray. They were two souls who had found their sanctuary not in a fortress or a sacred spring, but in each other. Their new life was just beginning, and so the silence of the valley was broken not by gunfire, but by the sound of two hearts beating as one. A testament to the fact that even in the most godless corners of the West, the greatest treasures are not what you can own, but what you are willing to fight to protect. If this story of redemption and courage resonated with you, tap that like button to honor their stand. In the comments below, tell us what is a debt that can never truly be repaid.